Welcome to episode 55 of the AMT podcast. Apologies for the delayed upload. I've been a bit under the weather since the weekend, and I also went traveling after the election, so haven't had any time to post a video. But today I do want to talk about last week's trading bonanza. Now, I did a write-up yesterday on Substack, so feel free to check that out. But there's a few more layers that I want to explore, and it's probably more appropriate to do that via podcast format. So I want to talk about the same things today. So Donald Trump won the election in a sweeping victory. I think he won 312 electoral votes to 226. Now, what was tipped to be a closely run race turned out to be a pretty clear-cut win for Trump. And I did tip him to win the election at 1.7. I also tipped Trump to win Pennsylvania at odds of 1.9. And I tipped Donald Trump to win the popular vote at 2.2. So it was a clean sweep for us as well as traders, and I posted that in my premium letter on Substack. So if you want to join that, if you want to see my future tips, then I'll leave the description in the below and feel free to join. Now, this traded a little bit differently to previous elections where there was a lot of back and forth action, but Trump's price pretty much steamed in aggressively right from the beginning before the results were even counted. So clearly there was some shrewd action going on. Now, whilst Trump winning did not come as a surprise, the manner in which he won did. He smashed the blue wall states, which Kamala was relying on. He completed a clean sweep across the Rust Belt states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The election effectively hinged on these battleground states, including Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and South Carolina, where Republicans were favorite. But Donald Trump won all of them, and decisively. In my betting preview for the event, I've referenced the polls and historic voting patterns since they were the only quantitative data available for gauging sentiment. Now, the polls pointed towards a very tight race with either candidate leading by no more than a few points in each swing state, with Trump ahead slightly in aggregate. And in my preview, particularly in the last episode on this podcast, I launched a pretty scathing attack on polls. The polls were wrong for Brexit. They were wrong in the 2016 and 2020 elections. And whilst being wrong is bad enough, the margins by which the polls were wrong was even more troubling, and that proved to be the case again. The most amusing result was actually in Iowa, where Donald Trump secured the vote comfortably in 2016 and 2020. The Republicans were heavy favorites, again, but it wasn't without drama. Ann Selzer, widely regarded as the best pollster in the country. I think the media even refer to her as the queen of polling. She actually holds the rare distinction of A+ for accuracy. And she bizarrely claimed, I think a day or two before the election, that Harris had a 3-point lead in Iowa. And her rationale was that there's a rise in independent and women voters who were turning out for Kamala. Trump ended up winning Iowa by a whopping 13 points. And Selzer's response was that the poll frightened Republicans into fear of losing, so they ended up turning up in droves. And whilst it's plausible, the point still stands. Polls are Stone Age material. As explained in my preview, they are ripe for manipulation. And because of the small sample size, they can paint any picture that the pollster desires. They're useless at predicting outcomes, so why do we still use them? And there's a few reasons for that, which I want to explore in this episode. Psychologist Philip Tetlock sums it up pretty perfectly. He said that we need to believe that we live in a predictable, controllable world. So we turn to authoritative people who satisfied that need. It's the same reason why investors listen to stockbrokers or economists and financial analysts, even though their track record of predicting booms and busts and the next hot stock is just as woeful. And it's the same reason why followers turn to religious leaders instead of finding their own truth because they need to be told what to think, or worse yet, justify their behavior. And people are just so enamored with status and titles that going along with the quote-unquote experts just seems like the right thing to do. And it makes doing your own homework redundant. After all, who are you to question the most acclaimed pollster or economist or politician or religious scholar? The truth is, had you invested in a passive index fund and ignored 85% of actively managed funds, you would have outperformed them over the last 10 years. Had you bet against the polls over the last 4 major political events, you would have been right. So buying into a narrative or one side of the argument tends to make betting tribal. When you are financially invested in the outcome, the more you want it to be true, and the more likely you are to believe any story that overestimates the odds of it being true. And this is why so many traders and political gamblers and news hosts who follow every update got it so wrong. Their disdain for Trump colored their vision so much so that the polls was all that was required of them to confirm their stance. And it's irrational. And this brings me to my next point. When is it ever reasonable to bet on something that looks irrational? Let's take cryptocurrencies, for example. Now, it's usually accepted that to trade or invest successfully, you should be emotionless. And that seems pretty rational. But if lacking emotions increases the odds of you walking away when the going gets tough, then suddenly what seems like rational thinking suddenly becomes a liability. The Bitcoin hodler who absolutely loves cryptocurrency and believes that it's going to overthrow modern banking and replace fiat currencies have an edge because they're more likely to stick with it. Now, the hodlers who sat on their Bitcoin through the last two bear runs would have seen their net worth wiped out by more than 75% on two occasions. No reasonable investor could watch the majority of their portfolio pretty much get wiped out and still carry on undeterred. But many long-term crypto maxis did just that. And they've outperformed the overwhelming majority of rational, emotionless traders who try to time the market. If loving your investments is what it takes to provide you with the necessary endurance to stick it out during the lean periods and put the odds in your favor, then being emotionally involved suddenly becomes an important part of your strategy. If you invest in something which you're not passionate about, then you'll have fun when you're making money from it. But when the tide moves against you and you lose money, it's just going to be easier to walk away. But if you love the product and you love the team, you love the mission, the message, the company, or whatever it is, then the hard times are blunted by the fact that you at least feel like you're part of something meaningful. And that can provide you with the necessary motivation to just not give up on it. And this is what makes political betting so dangerous, because a lot of analysts, commentators, and gamblers just bet on the team that they were in love with. They willfully ignored the failures of Democrats. They've ignored the fact that Democrats have moved so far to the left in order to cater to the LGBT or the anti-Trump cult that they've, in effect, isolated their main left-wing base. And they let their disdain for Trump blind them to his mass appeal, not just to white evangelicals or MAGA cultists, but ordinary, hardworking Americans who just want to return to normalcy. People can vote whatever way they want, but not many people can make the distinction between who they want to win and who they think will win. And when people attach themselves so deeply to a team or a party, they tend to conflate the two issues, and they just can't make that separation. And that's why so many intelligent, well-informed, sophisticated traders, pollsters, and news anchors got it wrong. They ignored what was objectively true in favor of what they wanted to be true. And this is congruent with cult-like behavior. Whether it's religion or politics or veganism or carnivores or whatever ideology you believe in. As soon as you make it part of your identity, then it becomes nearly impossible to look at the facts objectively. You start to look for confirmation bias and start to reject anything that doesn't fit your worldview, because then it becomes personal. Now, my views and values are fairly conservative, but I'm more than happy to discuss the failures of conservatives because I don't believe any party has monopoly over policy-making decisions. Now, I support Liverpool and I want them to win everything, but I'm not going to bet on them to win the league or the Champions League every year. I believe Floyd Mayweather is the best fighter ever, but I'm willing to have my mind changed if someone can present their case better. I also love my family, and I will spend a lot of money if it means protecting a loved one or giving them the support they need in order to give them the best possible chance of succeeding, even if the odds are stacked against them and they lack talent and there's a low chance of me making that return on my investment. We behave irrationally and reject being reasonable when there's a loved one or there's personal attachment involved. And that's perfectly okay. One can even argue that there's not much choice in that regard. But you do have a choice when it comes to making external ideologies a part of you. And in this instance, politics. Now, it's okay to be wrong. Everyone gets things wrong. But if you are wrong because you ignored what was factually true in favor of what you wanted to be true, then you have no business making trades or investments. Now, I know hindsight is 20/20, but looking back at this saga, I'm stunned that anybody could truthfully say that Kamala should have been the favorite, and many experts did. And this is a woman who blew through $800 million during her campaign. She was spending $450,000 a day just to have her face plastered on the sphere in Las Vegas as if no one knows who she is. This is a woman who spent 6 figures rebuilding someone else's podcast studio in Washington because she did not want to travel. This is a woman who's used a teleprompter in every single rally. Now, there's nothing wrong with teleprompters per se, but when every single speech is exactly the same, you look fake. And the fact that she refused to go on Joe Rogan's podcast in an unfiltered, unscripted 3-hour conversation only adds weight to that argument. Her demanding that Joe goes to her and he can only have an hour with her was pretty much the nail in the coffin. The mask fell off. This was a woman so out of depth, fake and incompetent that only a diehard leftist could ignore that. If you like Kamala Harris, then a vote for her is a vote for a world that you want to see, which is fair. But if you bet on Kamala Harris because you thought that she had a higher probability of winning than Donald Trump, then it's best to reevaluate your methodology. Now, I could easily have been wrong, and if that was the case, that's absolutely fine. It's not personal, and I would have had to go back to the drawing board. But the excuse making and just the meltdowns that have come from the left has been quite amazing. But with that aside, the main takeaways from this election for me is that polls have not advanced. They are not a sophisticated means of collecting data, and in my opinion, should be a thing of the past. And the masses rely on polls because they're the only quantitative bit of data that we have to gauge sentiment of voters. And pollsters, much like economic analysts or index fund managers or religious leaders, are just nothing more than self-anointed gurus. They have a woeful record, but the average Joe is just so enamored with titles. Going along with the experts makes doing your own homework redundant. And the last thing is that political betting is so dangerous because people can't help but make their political leanings a part of their identity. So anything that you're emotionally invested in, it makes it nearly impossible to separate what you want to happen from what you think will happen. So hopefully these closing points encourage some introspection. Whether you were right or wrong, how objectively did you forecast your opinion? Did you balance the polls and voting history with qualitative data? Now, qualitative data is admittedly quite subjective, but as an avid consumer of trending content and by keeping my ear to the ground, I saw no reason to believe the exaggerated and slanderous portrait that legacy media had painted of Donald Trump. So this episode has just been another cataclysmic failure from polls and mainstream media. And man is deemed to repeat the same mistakes over and over again, as we've seen. And if that translates to value, then I'm all for it, because I'll be looking forward to betting against the tide many more times. But let me know what you guys think. Leave your comments below, and don't forget to share and subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next episode.